1961, April, you got the Bay of Pigs happens. And the book has great perspective. You did obviously what you remembered, but also what you researched, what you knew, the stories that you put together. And some really interesting dynamics come out of the Bay of Pigs. Primarily, don't trust the generals, don't trust the CIA, don't trust the FBI.
Yeah, my uncle was lied to by, not only by the CIA, by the three top officials of the CIA, Allen Dulles, Charles Cabell, who was the general, the military guy at the CIA, and Richard Bissell. And over the next year, he fired them all because of the Bay of Pigs. During the Bay of Pigs, they had lied to him. Nixon had planned the Bay of Pigs. Nixon intended to be president at that time. He had planned the Bay of Pigs, and my uncle came in and said, my uncle felt very uncomfortable with it because, why? He felt like Cuba's this is before the Soviets were in Cuba, that rose later. But he said, yeah, we don't like the government in Cuba, but, it's a little tiny island, and we don't get to choose what other people have as their government. And he had grown up going back and forth to Cuba from Palm Beach. They'd get on a boat and go over there and go to the casinos and stuff. And he knew that Batista was, who was overthrown by Castro, that Batista was a nightmare, and that he invited the mafia in to run the island, and he was oppressing, torturing people, and he understood that Castro had been revolting against something real and that the U.S. was involved in that. So he had a more nuanced view of it. And he didn't think he didn't like communists, but he didn't think America should be telling other countries, should be bullying other countries into telling them what kind of governments they should have. And Cabell and Dulles and Richard Bissell said, look, we've already armed these guys. They're trained. They've got, weapons, and they're dangerous. And if you keep them here, it's going to be a huge problem. You got to let them go.
And these were Cuban nationals that were in America training to go back and invade.
Yeah. And they were all kinds of people. Some of them became very close to my dad, particularly one called Harry Ruiz, who spent a lot of time with us as kids. He had been an engineer. He had been with Castro in the Sierra Maestre. So Castro had come over in, I think, 1957 from Mexico. And I talked with Castro. I spent a whole day one time. I spent a lot of time with Castro. One of the times I visited him with Cheryl and my kids, and we spent a whole day at his house talking about everything, including the assassination, everything. And he's a really interesting guy. But he told my son Aiden, who was then about 10 years old, was asking him about, because the day before we went to the Cuban National Museum and we visited the grandmother, which is the big ship, which is in the museum now. It's a cabin cruiser. I think it was like 60-foot cabin cruiser that they had come over. They had gotten a hold of that. There was a bunch of revolutionaries, Cuban revolutionaries, training in Mexico. And they had all come over in 1957 and landed on the beach. There's 63 of them had been on that boat. My son, Aiden, said to Castro, how did you decide which guys would come? Were they the ones who were most, fervent about communism? And Castro said, no, we just brought the smallest people because we wanted to fit as many as possible on. They were ambushed on the beach, and 11 of them made it up into the mountains to the Sierra Maestre. And from there, those 11 people created the Cuban Revolution. 3 years later, they marched into Havana on New Year's Day and took the country. It was really an extraordinary story. But one of those guys was a guy called Harry Ruiz, who was an engineer. He didn't like Batista. He wanted democracy. He had been very close to Castro, but when Castro had declared that Cuba was going to be a Marxist society, he had turned against him, like many of the people who'd been in the revolution with him, and gone over to the other side. He had fled to the United States, and then, was part of this Bay of Pigs. Some of the other people were just, they were people who were involved with the mob, which was running the casinos, or they were like bad actors from Batista's army. They were, officers who were like bad guys. They were like killers, torturers, those kind of. So it was a whole mix of people. But a lot of them were very idealistic. My uncle didn't want any part of it because he thought the U.S. cannot be involved in overthrowing the government of another country. That's not what we do as a country. So he was skeptical, and originally their plan was to have the U.S. Navy use amphibious vehicles to drop the men off, and he said, we're not going to do that. The U.S. government can't have anything to do with this. So they ended up getting a bunch of ships from United Fruit Company, which owned all the sugarcane fields in that had been nationalized by Castro. So they're the ones who dropped him, who dumped him on the beach. My uncle said, I want to make sure that you don't expect air cover from the United States military because you're not going to get it. And Dulles said, don't worry, when we land over there. My uncle said, how's this going to work? Because Castro has an army, 200,000 men. How are you going to get 1,200 men to overthrow him? And they said, we have the whole thing wired, that as soon as they land there, the nation is going to rise up. We have people from every sector of the country who are going to rise up and overthrow him. So they were just lying to him. He also, he knew a lot about military operations. And he said, you're landing on a beach here. It's not like when Castro came and landed in the mountains where he could go hide. There's no place to hide here. It's a beach with a swamp. And they said, don't worry, we got the whole thing under control. So as soon as they landed there, and Castro met them, he knew they were coming, and they were dying on the beach, Dulles went back and said, we need air cover. And my uncle said, no. And my uncle later said to his aides, they thought that I was a young president who would be terrified of having this, this terrible failure, and would give them the air cover and send in the Essex, which was the aircraft carrier. And he said he wasn't going to do it. He took public blame for the Bay of Pigs invasion. But privately, he said to his aides, I want to take the CIA and shatter it into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. Then after that, he fired Bissell, Cabell, and Dulles. And he wanted to appoint my father to run the CIA because he recognized the CIA was a huge problem for our country. And my grandfather said, you can't do that. You can't have your brother as the head of the spy agency. It's got a bad look to it. The optics are wrong. And he said, it'll be like Stalin and Molotov if they were brothers. They essentially were brothers. But, you could turn that spy agency against the American Republic pretty easily. And you got to make sure, to have some daylight between you and between the president, the executive, and the spy agency. So they brought out a guy called John McCone, who was a very pious Catholic, and he was a Republican conservative, and they were confident that he would end the monkey business over there. But in fact, McCone never knew what was happening there. Nobody ever told him what was really, happening at the CIA. And the indications are Dulles continued to run it from a distance. And when my uncle was killed in '63, I came home that day. The first thing my father did was to call the desk officer at the CIA and say, did your people do this? That was his first instinct. The second call he made was to Harry Ruiz, this Cuban who was at our house all the time. And Harry was then in Washington, D.C., with a famous writer who'd written a book about the Bay of Pigs, a famous American journalist. They were both in the hotel room, and my father said the same thing to him. Did your people do this? Was it the Cubans, the CIA Cubans? And then I came home early that I was pulled out of school. My mother picked us up. I was brought home with my brothers from Sidwell Friends. When I arrived at home, my father was walking in the lawn at Hickory Hill with John McCone. And we went down and hugged him, and McCone went back to the CIA. The CIA was only less than a mile from my house. So we rode our horses through the CIA every morning. My father took us on a horseback riding, 9 little kids, horseback riding at 6 o'clock every morning before breakfast. And we always rode through the CIA campus. And McCone would come to our house during the springtime and summer to swim every day at 4 o'clock after he got out of work. So my parents were close to him, and McCone was the first one to arrive at the house. And my father took him for a walk in the yard and said, "Did the CIA do this?" And McCone said, "No, I don't know anything about it." But so anyway, that was his first instinct. We had Green Berets at the house all the time. My grandfather, my uncle was very close to the Green Berets. My uncle started the Navy SEALs. Mm-hmm. But he also, the Green Berets had been started earlier, but the Pentagon would not let them wear their berets. And my uncle ordered the Pentagon to change that rule. So there was this, we ended up going a lot to Fort Bragg. We saw we ran the obstacle courses there, did the zip lines, and then they came to our house, and in one of the pastures, they created this really hairy obstacle course. And we had Cubans at our house all the time. When we rode in the morning, we would ride to the houses of some of the Cubans because my father and my mother found homes for them when they came back to the country. And they made sure they got into schools. They made sure all of them could find jobs. A lot of them were put in the U.S. military. The ones, because my father, his job was to get all those Cubans out of jail. Castro captured 1,200 of them. And my uncle was heartbroken and said, no matter what the cost, we got to get those guys out of jail. And so my father spent a year negotiating with Castro. And he sent 2 of his aides, John Nolan and Ray and John Donovan, who was this famous spy who had been at top of OSS. There's a movie about him that came out last year about a deal that he made to free a spy in East Berlin. But he was a famous spy. My uncle sent the 2 of them down to negotiate with Castro. They spent a year every weekend in Cuba, and they went all over Cuba. They went to Castro would go to baseball games every weekend. And they would go to the baseball games with Castro. They became very close to him. And they said that when he walked in the stadium, everybody in the stadium would jump up to their feet and cheer. And they were looking at that, and they said, "This is not orchestrated. These people love him." And they told that to my father and my uncle, and it started opening their eyes about Cuba. And the last day when my uncle's life, he had an ambassador at Verdadero Beach talking with Castro about détente. And my uncle said, "We don't care what kind of government you have. We want 2 things from you. One is get rid of any Soviet military in Cuba. Number 2, stop your efforts to disrupt Latin American governments, Che's efforts, and to disrupt the Latin American governments that were part of the Alliance for Progress." And Castro said, "We need to talk, but we need to do it when Che's not around." So my uncle had an ambassador with him at Verdadero Beach the day that he was shot, talking about détente and ending the embargo.